Góðan daginn. Komið öll sem blessuð og sæl og verið hjartanlega velkomin hingað í Þjóðminjasafnið. Guðmundur Ingi heiti ég, kallaði Mummi og starfa á landvernd. Það mikil ánægja að halda þennan hádegisviðburð hér í dag sem að landvernd og landgræðsla ríkisins gera í sameiningu. Þetta eitt af fjölmörgum samstarfsverkefnum sem að landvernd og landgræðslan standa í. Við höfum á undanförnum árum sennilega nær árlega verið með einn viðburð saman, gæti ég trúað. Svona opinn fyrirlestur. Gjörið þið svo vel. Svo vinnum við saman í fjölmörgum öðrum verkefnum og þar ber kannski hæsta nefna og helsta nefna verkefni landgræðslu með grunnskólum á Suðurlandi. Þar sem að við erum að leggja út landgræðslu tilraunir, fyllist salurinn. Þetta var allt planað, ég ætla bara að láta ykkur vita það. Því að hún Caitlin sem að vinna með mér, hún að leiðbeina hér 30 nemendum frá Kanada ef ég man rétt. Og hún ákvað að koma með þau og reynda sagði mér nú ekki náttúrulega að mæta með svona grand entrance eins og maður segir, en hún gerði það greinilega. Takk Caitlin. En allavega að þessu samstagsverkefni okkar með landgræðslunni sem að stendur yfir og búið að standa yfir í 2-3 ár. Að þar erum við að leggja út tilraunir í landgræðslu með nemendum. Og landgræðslan og hennar starfsfólk leggja þar til þekkingu og við líka náttúrulega. Og það alveg ótrúlegt að fylgjast með þessum krökkum. Þau eru 11 ára gömul, leggja út tilraunareiti bæði með það sem nota húsdýraáburð, venjulegan áburð, fræ, moltu úr skólunum og svo framvegis og sjá síðan árangur gerða sinna. Það er alveg frábært að upplifa þennan kraft og baráttu anda má eiginlega segja sem að þarna að verða til hjálpar landinu okkar. En hér í dag erum við komin til þess að hlýða á fyrirlestur Roger Crofts. And now I'm going to switch into English. Roger, I'm sorry, I was not telling them all of your merits in Icelandic. I was just talking about myself and, you know, you know how I am, my friend. Roger Crofts is an extraordinary person in my opinion. He has been coming here, I think, for the last 30 years, at least for about 25 times. And he has had a very fruitful cooperation with many Icelandic authorities, institutes, NGOs, and business and political figures. And I know that he has been of great help to the Soil Conservation Service throughout the years. He has written a number of articles about environmental issues here in Iceland, for especially newspapers, and in many instances on environmental governance here in Iceland, in particular as it relates to soil and vegetation management. Now Roger is here to celebrate Sveinn Runolfsson's birthday. I thought that Sveinn was turning 50 or 60, but apparently he was turning a bit older, and I want to use the opportunity to thank Sveinn, since he was retiring from his post as the director of the Soil Conservation Service for the last 44 years only. I want to thank you so much, Sveinn, for all your work for Icelandic nature and all the good cooperation that we at Landvernd have had with you. And I would like you all to stand up and give him a good applause. If there ever was a soldier for the environment, that is Sveinn. Now in his talk, Roger will question what progress there has been made in caring for the countries that is Iceland's outstanding natural environment. And without further delay, I give the floor to you, Roger. Thank you for being with us here today.
I assumed that you went down to Lagervau to make sure that the lecture room was full, and I'm really grateful to that. Of course, it's a great pleasure to be back here working with and seeing so many friends and colleagues. And I want to start off by, of course, recognising all the wonderful things that are happening here. All of my friends back home, as part of my promotion work, want to come to Iceland or have been already. And you all know about the number of visitors. It's a bit crowded walking down the Almannagjá these days, isn't it? And how many more are going to be coming in the future? Vast numbers. And all of a sudden people are thinking, oh, this is a magnificent country with 5 million inhabitants. And they're really surprised when I tell them what the real story is. And of course, you've done such a wonderful job in the aluminium production. You will see what I'm moving towards later. It's okay. It compared with other countries in the world, compared with those major polluters of the atmosphere, the USA and China, because you're using renewable sources for the electricity. And of course, that is quite clear from this diagram. We aim back home in Scotland to maybe achieve 50% of our electricity generation from renewable resources, which is very good on a windy day, but is totally impossible when it's calm. And of course, the statistics are wonderful, aren't they? The annual growth rate has picked up again. OECD reports output has recovered and the budget deficit has been eliminated. And of course, there's this wonderful cash cow called the United Kingdom electricity consumer. And my Prime Minister, without asking his fellow citizens, has decided with your late, unlamented Prime Minister to do a deal. And this is going to be wonderful for Iceland in all of the money that's going to come from British consumers. I will leave it at that for the moment, because that's a point I want to come back to. And of course, the economy has been rebalanced as a result of the aluminium economy and now the tourist economy. And I guess these figures are a few years out of date, as you can see. But quite clearly, tourism is growing, and I think it's now the largest single sector, maybe slightly over 30%. Now, from an economist point of view, well, that's really good, that diversification. So we should celebrate that, should we? We will see. And of course, and I could not let this occasion go without saying all the incredible work on soil conservation and land reclamation over the years, particularly with my dear friend Svet here. And it's been a pleasure to be here to celebrate his 44 years and to make sure he does some productive work in the future as well. So a tremendous amount of work gone on there. You're all familiar with that. Also, a very significant amount of designation of protected areas, to the extent that Iceland has more than achieved the Convention on Biological Diversity Aichi target of 17% of the land area designated. I shall come back to that later as well. And of course, there have been some successes. When I first came to Iceland, I remember the arguments in Lake Mývatn about the diatomite dredging and the damage that this was doing to the ecology and all of the dependent species. I just show here the hooper swans and the damage to their feeding areas in the past. And so we have to remember those successes. But you may think why I'm putting the picture of this wonderful man, Halldór Laxness. And the reason is quite simple, that he was one of the great environmental campaigners, if you think back into the 50s, the 60s and the 70s. And we have wonderful environmental campaigners, and some of them are in the room today, and it's really great to see Anders Snare, for instance, amongst others, and Mumi leading this rejuvenated Landvent in the way that he is. But I show this as well to say that despite all of the sane and sensible things that Laxness said all those decades ago, there's not been as much progress as any of us probably in this room, and certainly not me from outside, would have liked. Now, this is rather prophetic. When I decided to show this, I didn't know the answer coming from the ministry on Friday. But I want to say, many years ago, in a building in Reykjavik, Náttúruverndarmálum and Landgræðslan, the bosses were there, and some of you remember, because you were in that office, I can see you in the audience, working together. And one of the failures, of course, is that this proposed merger that was worked on by politicians, but what happened? Did some individual in the bureaucracy stop it? I hear so. I don't see that individual here today. And of course, we have to remember still the problem of erosion. It was beautifully brought out, I thought, in the OECD report in 2014 about the problem of subsidy to sheep, which, of course, we all know, along with all of the natural environmental hazards, creates these sort of problems and these major arthropods. And it's extremely difficult in this Arctic environment to retrieve these areas, despite all the science and all of the practice. And have you stopped to think that the most important thing there on that is not the electricity demand, not the employees, but the column that says owner? I hope I've got the ownership right. I've trawled the web. The point really is whether I've got it right or not. You don't own any of these companies. They're all foreign. They all work in the international corporate market. And, well, I think we all know. I spent many years working with the oil industry in the northern North Sea when I was in government. And we all know that these companies, of course, go where they can get the best deal. It's called shareholder value, I think, or something like that. So will they be still here? Are they really committed to this country? Particularly when there's pretty good evidence, I think, that the electricity prices that they pay are not what you would like to charge me and other consumers in the UK if you do the cable. And of course, there's still this mentality around, despite the national power plan, to utilise particularly the hydropower, but also to a certain extent the geothermal power. I've been asking people what they think is the corporate mentality of Landsverken these days, because, as I probably said before, I once went and was sat at the board table in Landsverken to be lectured at by the chairman, the chief executive, and the head of communications. And it was me who banged the table and said, no, I'm here for a discussion. I'm not here to be told what I'm thinking. I did get out alive, and my tyres weren't deflated. But it's very interesting, corporate cultures, because who runs the culture of that organisation? Is it the owners, i.e. the government or the people, or is it the engineers? Engineers like projects. We all know that. Oh my gosh, where's the next project then? But what I find fascinating about Iceland, and it was really brought home to me many years ago when a good friend of mine said, Roger, stop telling us about analogies from back home. Tell us what you think about here. And it's this point that you are prepared to listen So I think it's fair to say that all of those points there are still relevant and are still not being fully addressed by the politicians in the parliament, by the government party, by the ministries. We still have this natural resource exploitation mentality, and we're not using all of the green accounting measures that exist around the world. And there is still this a culture of fear and bullying, even to the extent that I have been told by people who have read articles that my friends, Icelandic friends, have translated into Icelandic in Morgunblaðið. Well, of course, you don't know what they really said, do you? It's probably not what you said. Such is that contorted culture, which sadly is still there. But when I hear that my national football team is not going to the Euro Cup, but yours is, when I see this wonderful boys' choir singing in Keflavik Airport, I think, wow, that's something about the vibrancy, the ability to stand up, you know, in an international theatre with all of these people moving in and out of the country. So there must be hope there. So let's turn to what we would like to see. We do need in Iceland to have this vision of caring for, of valuing and using the natural resources sustainably to benefit this and many future generations. This is not sustainable economy, sustainable tourism. They're oxymorons or ridiculous concepts, to be perfectly honest. Because unless we care for this resource, conserve, preserve where necessary, actively use it, we need to have this value mindset. And it's there. What I find in Iceland when I meet my friends, when I go to houses, there is this wonderful longevity of knowledge and history. But we also need to recognize that you're looking to create jobs for enjoyment, for exports. But it has to be within this most important, perhaps technically most difficult concept of natural carrying capacity. So much work has been done around the world on this, but we're not applying it here. So let's start off with protecting and managing nature. Guri and Jon Geir Pedersen and I, they're from the ministry, we published this article earlier this year where we recognise some of the positives: connecting protected areas, the larger scale, improving management structures, the conflict resolution machinery. But we also flagged up some challenges. I wanted to flag up more, but I had to respect my colleagues who work in the ministry. So let me flag them up now that aren't in the paper. Because the problem, sorry, Guri, the problem that we've had too often in nature conservation is what I call the postage stamp culture. And here's a classic example: relatively small areas. Yeah, I'm not just criticising you, we've done it back home as well. But this is very recent, 2009-13. For plants, small animals, habitat types and geological features. And here's another map from a slightly earlier period. Again, small areas. Okay, they're very important, but they need to be seen in that wider context. And of course, we still have to remember that there are large numbers of people. And I think this is true here, just the same as it is at home, who think, why do we have to protect all this nature? Is it just for the nature freaks? Yeah, we've got too many of these areas. They're too large. They stop development. There are too many rules. They ignore the locals. And worst of all, they're run by nature folk. And you know, I don't need, because I recognise the background of most of you in the audience of the we love side. But there's still that polarity. But what I think is much more important is to say, let's get away from the postage stamp to the larger area. Yes, you've done that in part. If you see the bottom bullet point there is a movement begun by a wonderful Canadian lawyer who lives in the Banff National Park, Harvey Locke, the Half for Nature movement. And this is saying, of the whole of the landscape, why can't half be for nature? It doesn't have to be protected. It's about the mentality of the way you look after the land. And we discussed this a great deal in the World Parks Congress in Sydney in 2014. Because if we have these small areas, they fail to satisfy the ecological needs. There are lots of boundary disputes. And so arguing for the much larger areas from the beginning seems to me, from my own experience and talking to many colleagues around the world, the right way to go. And it's not as though these ideas are new. I found this map by Gisli Gislason from 1998, which clearly shows the parliamentary motion almost 30 years ago now. No, 20 years ago now. For these very large national parks in the Central Highlands. And it's interesting, isn't it, that even if I can use this pointer, is that it? The enlarged Skaftafell National Park and the Fjällbäck Reserve, okay, that's now encapsulated virtually all of it, I think, in the Vatnajökull National Park, but certainly not the other two. And now, how do you engage, therefore, those people that are proving difficulty, those with traditional rights? Now, you know all about this. Here is a map of the commons. And you're all very familiar with the arguments about grazing levels in the commons. Svet always called it the battle for the commons, and the battle is still ongoing and not yet won. And Armand was telling me the other day about the difficulties of doing deals with those to the north of the Vatnajökull ice cap and in the Skeiðarársandur, which, you know, in all honesty, should be within the Vatnajökull National Park. But we have a major international movement run by colleagues of mine, especially in Switzerland and in Spain and in India, through the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas, of community-conserved areas. And in a sense, how can you change the mindset of these people from thinking that they can take a grazing crop from the rocks and the little bit of salix that's left into something that they welcome the long-term caring and stewardship of those areas? And then, of course, we have what, to be perfectly honest, is an amazing approach of the plan for energy. Gosh, I wish we had some process like this back home. And we've had total nonsense with wind turbines and the power lines from them. I mean, what is amazing about it, it has statutory basis, it has expert input, it has proper consultation processes, and it has clearly defined criteria. And in the end, what I would call the traffic light system. Yeah? Green, that's for no-go. Red for go and in between. And I think that's wonderful, and it's really tremendous how far it has gone. It's very easy to think, oh, well, we haven't won the battle yet. And I do worry about that, because that's why I asked the question, is it really working? Are there political processes undermined it? More particularly, are the beloved plans of Landsverken engineers being challenged? because we know where their plans are. I even know that from reading in the Guardian newspaper back home, for instance. And of course there is the problem, and I hope that my dear friend Thorellen doesn't take this wrong, but I think she knows what I mean by the last bullet point. Do the wrong people just give the wrong answers in the committee? Because it's a heavily politicised process. But don't let it be undermined. I mean, it is vitally important. But it does mean making some decisions for protection. And it means challenging these other things. Already we have the Husavik silicon plant and the geothermal power for it. Is there talk on is it the Blanda or in that area in the north there? What might still happen at Helkavik? And my Prime Minister's beloved power cable. Now, where's the energy going to come from that? Back home, it says it's going to be from a geothermal source, but the EU experts tell me, well, it can't be from the Krafla-Lerenuka area. There is just not enough energy. So, well, what's the next plan that's got the positive light for development? Oh, wow, yes, it's 3 projects on the Lower Thorsa. So, is that, because you don't need this energy, unless you have more smelters, God spare us. So are you going to develop the Lower Thorsa to rescue us in the UK from our total and utter incompetence, irrespective of whether it's a Labour administration, a socialist or a conservative? We are, because of climate change obligations, closing down the major coal thermal power plants. We are trying to get the Chinese and the French to develop unproven nuclear technology in our country, which will cost us a fortune in the future. And we're in a pickle. But to be perfectly honest, if you put that cable in with the agreement of our government, it will land in the north of Scotland, and then we have to have major overhead pylons for it to get to our consumers, which happen to be in England, because you don't want the DC cable too long. And wait a minute, if it's going to be the Lower Thorsa, how are you going to get it to the takeoff point somewhere in the southeast corner? What about right round the coast, along the side of Route 1, that major tourist route? Oh dear. Have people thought this out? My Prime Minister hasn't. I've written to him. Don't get a reply. We've got an easy solution. We just use the gas contracts and build some more gas stations to tide us over until we sort out what we're really going to do. Maybe small-scale nuclear. But I honestly do not believe that you should be rescuing us from our incompetence just because you have some engineering schemes that Landsverken would like to pull out. Thank you, Snorri. And of course, do we have more smelters? I know it's not an aluminium smelter at Baki, but it's a silicon plant. Is it right what Trygve Finsen is saying here, that it really is jobs? Because when I check with people about the number of jobs and the social and economic benefits in Rødrefjorda from the Fairdale plant, there's still lots of empty apartments. It's not a living, vital, lively community. Whereas Igorstader, as it develops its further and higher education and its tourism centre and all the rest, could be much more vital. And then, of course, this is one of the articles that was translated, by the way, which I don't know what it says. It transduces what I said. My point really is here, and this is some years ago, over a decade now. Are you, the Icelandic community, led by organisations like Landvernd, challenging the companies, Alcoa, Alcan, Rio Tinto, about their corporate social responsibility? If not, why not? Because when you hear the leaders of Rio Tinto, for instance, speaking internationally, and I have done in recent years, they're like as green can be. But are they really shelling out? Are they giving you a few tens of millions of kroner where they should be giving you hundreds and hundreds of millions? And what about Landsverken? It's a state enterprise. You, the Icelanders, own it. So what is its role in playing a much more corporate, social and environmental responsibility? And all that, if you like, brings me to what I think is the obvious conclusion. It's one, I have to say, Mumi, that my late lamented but very dear Icelandic friend Magnus Magnusson once said to me, but simple, Roger, you need a national park for the whole of the Highlands. So excellent that Landvernd are leading on this idea, because it goes back to connecting all the little pieces, stopping the postage stamp approach, but having this big picture and beginning to recognise that it's not just one part of the Highlands, that it is the whole lot. And what I really like about this, it is a whole series of systems, but they're all similar systems in terms of their earth history and their present processes, in terms of their ecological significance, and actually in terms of their global significance. And I think if there's one thing that I hope will come from more and more people visiting Iceland, is the recognition of the global significance of Iceland's environment, because it's nature, and nature in the raw and in the real. But in addition to campaigning for this idea, and keep campaigning, and I will do whatever I can through my World Commission on Protected Area networks, because they're fully appraised of the importance of the heart of Iceland. There is time to settle some long-running issues. And you'll know what I'm coming to. You can see the photograph taken from the top of Kjartafelt. That was right, wasn't it, Axel? We were there one day. Arnarfelt, sorry, Arnarfelt, thank you. I mean, what an amazing scene. I was also very lucky of having something read from the Bible by Axel when we were there, but you don't need to be a geomorphologist like myself or an ecologist or a fluvial expert to just look at that in absolute wonder. But there are still those, I know it's been ruled out in the discussions on the power plan, but there are still those that talk about Nordlingeröldvetta, excuse the pronunciation, and this amazingly important argument about the height of the dam, whether it should be like that or like that or like that. There shouldn't be any dam there at all. It's quite simple, isn't it? Because here is an amazing feature itself, the Mulla-Jökull surging glacier. And if you walk, how many of you have walked around the moraine of that? Oh, it's only the little clan, isn't it? Oh, dear. Thor Ellen, you've got to do some more FI tours around there. I mean, it is astounding walking around this perfect curve and observing the landscape and all of the different vegetation mosaics that Thor Ellen has so wonderfully mapped in the past and that are really extraordinary. So it's quite simple to me. As I say, I'm a geomorphologist. I look at big systems and I say, well, okay, we know that Thorisvatn exists and Saltnagalen, the reservoirs, and some of the dams and the transfer canals and all the rest of it. But the scale of the Thorsá catchment is much the biggest in Iceland. What are we doing about it? You know, we should not just be thinking about a bit more protection here, as I and others have argued, and you all have from within Iceland, the whole flipping lot, you know, the whole system. And that's really important. And it amazes me that even when some ministers were almost ready to sign the paper, there was a blockage. And it wasn't a blockage out in Landsvirkjun. I suspect it was a blockage in the bureaucracy. Was it lawyers? I will say no more. But also, I think it's extremely important, and Iceland's good at this, at what I call adopting international approaches. You've got a couple of geoparks, Katla and the Reykjanes Peninsula. The interest of those is that they're not there to protect and preserve the geological heritage. They're there to celebrate it and to make sure that visitors coming to the area have a greater appreciation of it, and there is benefits to the local communities. And it's this local benefits that is really important. And I would like to see more consideration of that. You know, if you look at the map of the geoparks across Europe, we have 3 in Scotland, despite what the map says, and we have lots of others in the UK. And to help you, we have quite recently set up in the World Commission on Protected Areas a geoheritage specialist group. And when you look at this presentation on YouTube, you'll be able to get that link there and find a whole expert network. And those of you here or your colleagues elsewhere in Iceland who are geoheritage experts, we'd really like you to join us in that great effort. And then, of course, there is the quite different UNESCO approach, which is, I think we all regard the ultimate accolade, the World Heritage Site. Surprisingly enough, you only have Surtsey that is listed for the natural site, Thingvellir for the cultural site. And when we reviewed the Thingvellir application, we said, why on earth are you not looking at the importance of the tectonic plate boundary, as well as also this incredible freshwater biology in Thingvallavatn itself. So ideas of having more World Heritage sites, I think, is very important. And I'm delighted that the government has invited the Vatnajökull National Park to draw up proposals in pretty short order. But I do ask the question, well, why just Vatnajökull? Yes, it's very important because of the interplay of the processes of tectonic plate hotspots and ice caps. But there are a lot of other examples as well in other parts of the country. And I would like to see you develop, and I've said this before, but I will continue to say it, a suite of World Heritage sites. You've got all the geological expertise you could possibly need, and it would fit beautifully then into the other sites that are already in the North Atlantic, like the St Kilda Archipelago off the west of Scotland, the Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland, etc. But, dear friends, too often those of us in the nature protection business spend all of our time debating of the new sites and the new areas and struggling for designation. It means nothing, absolutely nothing whatsoever, unless we look after these places and we know what's going on. And there is a major challenge to many countries to say, do these places match international standards? We've just spent the last 4 years in the UK, 4 of us particularly who have all been to Iceland before, doing what we call putting nature on the map, where we have taken the IUCN definition of a protected area and its 6 components, and we've rigorously tested it against every type of protected area. And some of them fell out, the National Scenic Areas of Scotland. And I'm currently having an argument with the government and the agency about whether they should be toughening up standards so it will fit. And also, for those of you who know about these, there are a series of management categories which style different places. The wilderness areas, the research areas, like say, the so-called national parks, which are the sort of big areas which allow informal access, the national monuments, the plant and animal restoration areas, etc. And there's also a whole lot of governance types. That's all on the web. It's well known. We can, with my colleagues, help you address this so you can properly join the international family. Then you can make sure that the data that is on the UN World Conservation Monitoring Centre Protected Areas portal is really accurate. And people can then, anybody can look at that and say, yeah, they've done a job. But then that's not the job quite finished, because it's also saying, well, is the management really effective? And there is a whole international standard called Management Effective Evaluation. And, of course, a crucial part of that is, well, what are the governance systems? Are they inclusive systems? Are they involving the local communities, the scientific knowledge communities, the culture communities, as well as the government representation? And I would encourage you also to think about that approach as well. Maybe the organisation that is probably not... Is there anybody here from Umhverfismál? No. Well, you better go and tell them what I'm saying. I'll send this to Christine Linda. Yes. And, of course, looking after visitors. What was interesting in the OECD report was challenging Iceland to say, hey, wait a minute, you've got to think seriously about your machinery of collaboration between organisations. You've got to think seriously also about the infrastructure you put in place and how you manage the visitors. You've got fabulous facilities. Here's Lindsay sitting at the FI hut below the holy mountain of Heatherabed, and that was wonderful. Except we had to sleep under the table that night, but at least we had a bottle of whiskey with us that we didn't let the Germans have. And there's these fabulous places. I think this is on the Holmsau, before it rained, Thorellen, yes? Now, these sites are fantastic, but they're not managed sites, you know? And as people come from other countries, they need to respect what they're coming to. They need to respect that environment, and a little more management in these places, and the sort of, if you like, the obligations are vitally important. And, of course, keep producing the literature. I have to show this of the wonderful GPO with all of his books, but also his campaigning spirit. Please keep producing these wonderful booklets. There's a lovely guidebook to Vatnajökull National Park by Thorleif, I can't remember his surname now. Magnificent. Yeah, thank you. And it's these books, don't just produce them in Iceland. I am delighted to see so many signboards around the country now that Lindsay and I can understand, because the English as well as the Icelandic. And that's very important, because, is it not, surely, trying to develop knowledge tourism? So wonderful interlocutors like Vigdis, Magnus Magnusson, Andres Arnolds, with, God, an old boy, that's me there, on my first visit, going and listening to the sagas and the delivery of the lawman's speech at the Louwberg, at the original Althingi. Absolutely amazing. That it transforms your experience of this country in a way that others don't. And there is a serious point here. I'm not trying to tease you, but to have real authorities like Gisli Mau Gislason and Thor Ellen go on a trip with them is so vital. But of course, it's expanding that network of experts, and there are a lot of you here, getting them to take foreign parties. I've usually been the only non-Icelander in these trips, and it is wonderful. It's a revelation. It's inspiring. But develop this whole expert tourist guide, because then you can begin to promote the country in a quite different way. Not just the natural history, but the cultural history as well. And hopefully, well, we might live in hope, that we will begin to educate incoming visitors, as well as locals. These are a couple of locals, I think, on the lower slopes of Eyjafjallajökull the year before the eruption. So I'm delighted to see these signs around the country and in the hire cars when you get them, trying to get people to understand the fragility of the environment. And that connection between the environment and good behaviour or bad behaviour is really extremely important. But you can, and let's also say to people, you can have wonderful experiences, challenging experiences in the Highlands, crossing the rivers, but you need to know what you're doing. So there again, it's having the Icelandic experts with you that is vitally important. You can have good fun, like here on the Hvítá, just below Gullfoss. All these people lined up, but all sensibly closed and with proper people looking after them. And of course, the importance of visitor information. Of course, I'm bound to promote Sangaragada, the soil conservation one, because Svet and I have worked on this. But one of the things we were working on was how to ensure that the English, the non-Icelandic language, was understandable to non-Icelanders, and that intelligibility. And also making sure people know where it is, and making sure that the designs are better. I think this sounds out like a sore thumb. Sorry. It doesn't look right. At Almanagaya. And this, locating a visitor centre up a valley with nothing else there, that costs many, many millions of Icelandic kroners at Skrúðarklaustur, as opposed to putting it in Ingólfsstaðir, alongside the facilities that are there, supporting the local service industries. And I hope that the one that you're developing for Kirkjubólaklaustur will learn the lessons from Skrúðarstaðir, and that if it's not right in the village, it's close by, and it's not taking business from the locals, it's actually supporting local businesses. Because that way, you get a good facility for tourists, but you at the same time get an excellent facility that benefits the locals. And for goodness sake, tidy up some of the atrocities. Do I need to mention Landmannalaga? I mean, this is one of the most amazing landscapes on earth, and it is a mess because it's not managed. And please be careful about, the type of infrastructure you put in. I know it needs to be durable in these weather conditions, but think hard about what you're doing. Make sure that you have the right provision. This is just a group of locals up the valley from Hveragerði. You remember Andres. but not enough parking. Where do you put the car park? Can you hide it in the landscape? Yes, there's plenty of good examples. We've learnt the hard way back home. And in terms of creating footpaths, don't leave it to the digger driver. It was fortunate that day that Andres Arnolds was there to advise him. Learn from others. We've got plenty of expertise on developing footpaths. A strategic approach is required. Don't just send the JCB driver in there. Make sure that you have the technical skills not to develop these paths, but to look after them, to maintain them, to manage them, to know how to deal with water and slope. And make sure you provide the finance. And of course, therefore, this ongoing argument of, should we have a tourist tax? To me, it's quite simple. Just charge an entry or an exit tax. It works beautifully. To be honest, people don't notice it. We've done it ourselves, Lindsay and I, when we've been travelling, particularly in Latin America. Compared with the airfare, it's nothing but the cumulative effect. Because we know that bed night taxes are hopeless. How can you do bed night taxes? People are staying in hostels or they're camping. You really need to get a tax system that is not going to deter the tourists. I mean, we've just paid, say £300 sterling. Sorry, I can't quickly translate that into my head to fly from Scotland on EasyJet. Well, if you charge me another £30, £40, I'd say, brilliant. So just do it. And also think about the ownership and management of sites. There are sites that are in private ownership that are long-running management issues. It's particularly important at places like Geyser, which, of course, is an internationally famous site, the type site for the name, etc. And let's not forget the need for continuing to reclaim and stabilise the land. Lots more to be done there. Stop arguing about the rights and wrongs of non-native species. It really is wrong in Morsadalen, in the Vatnajökull National Park, but it's been extremely effective on across the Myrdalsanda to stabilise things and hope. But that means it needs to be underpinned by some knowledge. Where do the streams go from the Yakaloops of Katla, for instance? So don't let the local road engineers decide where to put the bridges because they haven't studied the nature. So have a much more technocratic approach. Of course, remember the native species, which is so effective, Lamus arenarius. And also remember the vast amount of research that's been done to understand what's happened before the settlement and since the settlement in terms of the evolution of land. And there it's really nice that some of my academic geography colleagues in Scotland have been doing a lot of work with some of your colleagues. But please use that to help in the reclamation efforts, as well as these wonderful ideas of huge areas of birch woodland ecosystem like Hekla, which also has been one of the driving forces behind. And then you get these wonderful results, and you can go and watch the birds in peace and harmony. Now, when you drive around Iceland, of course, there's so many drainage ditches. And if you're a farmer and you own a JCB, you want to go and use it, so you dig the ditch out again. Has anybody told him about the carbon flux from doing that? It must be absolutely enormous. And I think some statistics to put that over would be really valuable. And I really hope that beginning now of re-wetting, it's dead simple, actually, in terms of blocking drains. There's a couple of examples from Scotland on 2 raised mires. All you do is to shove the wood or the plastic in. Don't do anything else. The water table rises, the plants colonise, and you get a carbon benefit straight off as well as an ecological benefit. in saying that, I must recognise that there are places where you really have to control rivers. You can't allow the Markiaflot after a Yakaloop to join with the Thorsau and the Ranga. That would be nonsense. So we have to recognise those things. So, what does all this mean? Connecting all the pieces into a single whole. I call that natural common sense. So there's forestry development, there's soil conservation areas, there's nature conservation areas. But how do you join all of those up? And how do you make sure that we use the major ecological thinking of networks and corridors and do it within the context of the different bioregions of the country, of which there are, 15 or 20, depend on how you divide it up, and then think of the whole landscape. And what's vitally important there, of course, is to make sure we have the right knowledge, what I call the ecosystem knowledge. In many countries, we've got totally fixated with ecosystem services. Well, that's for us. That's for our benefit now. And that's been a political driving force. But let's remember, it's the function of the ecosystem that is the crucial thing. If you interrupt it, we've lost the services, or they're damaged or depleted. And particularly, we need to make sure that we feed all of this knowledge into the green accounts, so that it's not just looking at GDP, for instance, and that we make sure that we have the exchange of knowledge from all of this work into the decision-making system. And my gosh, you do need to change the decision-making system. There are far too many bodies that are jostling in the same area, in the same territory. And we really need something, and this is something that the OECD report brought out as well, although it pulled its punches. I'm not going to pull mine. I'll tell you the answer on the next slide. Is the functional integration that's required. It gives you resource efficiency as well, which is vitally important, and I think it gives you greater creativity. You've got to cover the conservation, the restoration, the ecological health, and the natural productivity. Well, we've got different organisations all doing a bit of that, but not together. And crucially, it needs to be an organisation that can look at strategy and action, and that can be informed by knowledge development and transfer, as well as supported by all the typical functions. So what you need is Alderlinda Stofnan. Okay, you got it? It's quite simple. Natural Resource Conservation Iceland, please. It is so obvious to any of us from outside. We didn't quite get there in the UK, but we realised when we looked back in the 70s that we chopped off the science from the conservation. It was absolutely lunatic. So Nature Umhverfisstofnun, what little bit of it's left, needs to be repatriated into a proper organisation that understands nature. The Natural History Institute for Iceland, sorry, I can't say that one. There is the repository of all of the data and the information and the monitoring. Why is it somewhere else? Why that data should be informing the work in developing strategy and action. Landgræðslan needs to be in there as well, because it is quite rightly straying into management beyond agricultural land. And skogrækt, well, are you really expecting to grow productive timber in Iceland, or are they not really doing ecological restoration? Bring them all together. Alderlinda Stofnan, please. Are you written it down? I'm told on good authority by some of my colleagues that that would be the right name. And I'm not going to go through all of this, my time is up. But you need to have a natural resources strategy for Iceland. It's fascinating, isn't it, that the Department of the Environment was made the Ministry for Environment and Natural Resources, but the ministry doesn't have a strategy. sorry, I'm a strategic person. I worked in ministries and we did strategy. How do you know what you're going to do? How do you inform the components of what's going to happen? The what, the how, the who, and the outcome. Let's just focus on that before I finish. Iceland as the laboratory and the best exemplar of real sustainable development in natural resources. And then we can connect that to the international goals and make sure we do the new Sustainable Development Goals, the CCD targets, the HE biodiversity targets, and the outcome of the Paris FCCC COP last year. And then, Kjatafell, the heart of Iceland. Did God really inscribe that lateral moraine like that? It is so magical as an emblem. And what Nelson Mandela said over a decade ago. I don't need to read it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Roger, for your inspiring talk. Time's up, but and I'm usually strict on time, actually, except I'm not very punctual. Anyways, I will allow at least one question, perhaps two. Depends on how long they are and how long you will take to answer. So, is there anyone there? Say.
Virðulega samkoma, ég má til með að þakka Mummi minn má ég þakka kærlega fyrir þínar góðu hamingjóskir og fyrir samstarfið milli landgræðslunar og landverndar sem hefur staðið í áratugi og verið alltaf að aukast og ég sannfærum það að starfsfólk landgræðslunar minn gera allt sitt til þess að auka það enn frekar á komandi árum. Og dear Roger, thank you for your fantastic presentation, and also I have to take this opportunity to thank you for your guidance in the past decades to the Soil Conservation Service, for your guidance, inspiration, and telling us what to do and not to do, but above all, we treasure your friendship, yours and Lindsay. There's no comment about your outstanding presentation, just second your ideas about the natural resources conservation. Thank you.
You will not get to comment on that, Roger. Does anyone have a burning question for Roger Crofts? Or does anyone want to challenge what he just said? I'm sure he would actually love that more. Yeah, go ahead.
How do you imagine, development in the electricity and energy in different remote places of Iceland? Because we're not talking about big dams that are dangerous. How do you see Iceland developing regarding that outside of Reykjavik?
Well, I think you have much more. Sorry, I need to come here, don't I? You have what we call distributed generation systems. So there's no, I mean, I know the Vesterfjorda, for instance, and the far northeast have problems. They need to be recognised. But you can have much small-scale facilities. You know, on hydro, there are run-of-river schemes which are getting better in the way that they're developed not to interrupt natural fishery migration. Are there things, small wind turbines that you can put up? Yes, there are aesthetic problems. What about all of the devices where you've got a good tidal flow as well? What I think you should try and avoid is the big centralised system and the power lines going all over the country. You know, we've done that back home. We needed to, but I think we're beginning to regret it. I mean, there are even some people that are promoting small nuclear power systems. You probably don't want to go along that route. But there's quite a movement in the USA on that front from alternative thinkers.
Caitlin, go ahead.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. And thank you for letting my student group come and listen as well. Sorry we took up half the auditorium. My question is your recommendation for a sort of holistic and coordinated natural resources strategy. I feel that's already being done with Rammaáætlun, the master plan. And wouldn't another effort suffer from the same pitfalls, or do you have some advice for how we can go about it differently?
It's only been done to a certain degree with Rammaáætlun, after all, because that was focusing, as the title said, on adjudicating between nature conservation and hydro and geothermal power. What I'm talking about is a plan that embraces the agricultural land, the river systems. I'm not talking, therefore, just about the, if you like, the highlands and the rivers that come from them. Let's not forget the west, the Vesterfjord, and the other parts of the country. And what I would liken it to is the plan that was drawn up in the early years of this millennium, the Sustainable Development Plan, which I thought was an excellent plan. I don't know how it's referred to a lot in the OECD report. It's if you like, it's the level below that, so that it covers all of the land and all of the sea as well. Otherwise, how do the ministries and all of the plethora of agencies know what on earth they should be doing?
Right. Oh, I have to talk into this as well. You're being videotaped here. Are there more questions from the audience? Or should I start now? No, just kidding.
We have some time afterwards.
Yeah, we'll take one more. There is one in the back, and then we will.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question with regards to what you said earlier about the energy production. Usually there's a lot of discussion about renewable energy resources, that we should invest in that one. But I seem somehow always to miss the discussion about why do we always need more energy, in general terms. Yeah. I think this is like it circulates often in this discourse. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on that part of the discussion.
Actually, that is the most fundamental point about in the energy debate, which is usually ignored because we're wanting to develop new. It's actually how you make more efficient the use of what we have already. And so the technologies are there. What we call smart grids, for instance, how you can switch between different power sources at different times of the day. Massive amounts of research done on that. How can we have better insulation of our houses? How we change the fueling, and these are the real crucial ones, how we change the fueling of heating and cooling of our houses. And how we particularly change the fueling of our transport. They were the things that will make a huge difference. So if you listen to experts, for instance, from the International Energy Association, they will say the first thing to do is energy efficiency. Don't think about new facilities at all. And I can't quote you the statistics from Iceland, but from back home in Scotland, where we're just about to do another independent energy review from our National Academy, it's if we can fix transport and heating, then we've changed the pattern. But if we can also, at the same time, tell people that reducing their energy consumption doesn't mean that they've got to wear 3 Icelandic sweaters and a TOG 25 duvet. Actually, they're saving money and being more efficient. Okay?
All right, thank you so much, Roger. Unfortunately, we cannot allow more questions, but Roger has accepted to stay for a few minutes
Yeah,
if
sure.
someone wants
Yeah.
to chat with him here afterwards. So, having said that, thank you all so much for coming and enjoy your afternoon.